I am very, very thrilled to have Dr. Roberta Ervine here being our speaker tonight.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate the introduction. As we all know, Lent has just ended, technically speaking, and we're now in Holy Week, which is, the slides are not moving. Oh, I see. Okay, we'll start again. Holy Week is just Lent's more stringent, more demanding, and if you're going to follow or participate in all of the available services, Lent's more tiring culmination. And we can tend to think of this whole pre-Easter period as one of deprivation. And so we might balk at that for whatever personal reasons we have. And actually, now that I think of it, maybe it would be fun some other time to look at how the fathers describe all of the inventive ways that people in earlier centuries came up with to avoid doing real fasting while appearing to fast, keeping the letter of the fasting regulations more or less, while totally gutting their intent. But that's for another day. This time of deprivation is symbolized visually to us by the curtain that deprives us of the altar. And most of us who are watching the services online this year feel even more deprived than ever. However, these weeks before Easter are not about deprivation. For some people, the word restraint gets a little closer to the meaning we want it to have. But while deprivation and restraint can both be helpful entry-level understandings of Lent and Holy Week and Armenian fasting in general, there's much more to it than that. In his letter to the Georgians, calling for inter-Christian tolerance and dialogue, the great 12th century Armenian Vartabed, jurist, and author of fables, Mkhitar Ghosh, praised the good characteristics of all the local Christian confessions, wanting to show how everyone can learn from the other's faith. And so he says the following. Antagonistic though they sometimes were towards Armenians, he said, having heeded John Chrysostom, Greeks are wise and compassionate. Roman Catholics are prompt in prayer and submissive to their primates. Syrians are humble and ascetic. Georgians honor saints and monasteries and do not speak ill of their primates. All of these are worthy Christian qualities from which Armenians, Mkhitar added, could learn a thing or two. And then Mkhitar proudly adds his own nation's admirable, emulable characteristics. He says, Armenians fast. They also show generous charity toward captives and clergy, and they love all things holy. You notice how he put fasting first on that list? He wasn't kidding about that either. If we were to put together all of the fasting days in the Armenian calendar as a block, they would amount to around 5 months, a little less than half the year. That is a lot of time to designate for fasting, which, as you know, in current Armenian practice, means a vegan diet without alcohol. Yeah, I know. Alcohol technically is a plant food. Life is not fair, nonetheless. By including alcohol on the list of things one does not ingest while fasting, Armenians who actually follow their own liturgical calendar get to detox regularly. And this, as I'm sure you've noticed, is a very trendy thing to do these days. You just go online, you look for cleanse, And you'll see what I mean. There's the juice cleanse, the skinny cleanse, the 3-day detox me cleanse, the colon cleanse, the faster cleanse. The list goes on. In other words, something people in the West are just discovering is really good for you, especially if you regularly eat processed foods or consume adult beverages. Armenians have been doing a stellar job of it for a couple millennia. Plus, fasting was a frequently prescribed remedy in ancient medicine. So we moderns are coming pretty late to the party, so to speak. Have you heard of the 5-2 diet? The one where you eat 5 days a week and then you take in no food on the remaining 2 days? Or you can have up to 500 calories on those days, but really why bother at that point? It's now becoming a serious thing. It's being given luster and publicity by the likes of Gisele Bündchen, Jimmy Kimmel, Benedict Cumberbatch, or if you prefer your stars more cerebral than those, economist Paul Krugman, all of whom are said to follow this system and to love it. Well, Armenians have been doing the 5-2 program for 49 weeks or so out of every year since the start of their Christianity. And I might remind you, they kicked off their Christianity with a 5-day full fast at the end of the 65 days of pre-baptismal instruction that St. Gregory put them through so that they would understand what it was that they were getting into, and that they would understand how the faith and its practices had made him, Gregory, so very, very extraordinarily resilient, focused, clear-headed, and agile. As Christians, their same mental clarity could be found through the means that he had used. And fasting was certainly part of the picture. In addition to the Wednesday and Friday fasts from Pentecost to Punparagentan, the Armenian Church also marks the changing seasons and certain major events in the Church's faith history with week-long fasts. This useful list of the longer fasts was made by one of our diocesan clergy, and it gives you a general idea of the times and the events that were found worthy of being dignified with a fast. So you can see the week before Theophany, the fast of the catechumens, then you have Lent, Avak Shapat, the week before Transfiguration, the week of the discovery of St. Gregory's relics, the week before the Assumption of the Mother of God, the week before the exaltation of the cross, the week of Advent, sorry, Eric, 50 days before Theophany, the week of the start of spring, which is sometime in Lent, the week of the start of summer, the fast of Elijah, the week of the start of autumn, which is between the Feast of the Cross of Varak and I think the Feast of St. George, and then the week of the start of winter, the fast of St. James of Nisibis. So yeah, Armenians have always been champion fasters. But why? Is it for the health benefits? Well, on one level, yes, certainly. The fathers agreed that a constantly eating body is a torpid body, not to mention the mental haze, the overall lack of resilience, and the greater vulnerability to disease that come with that. The 5th century Catholicos Jovan Montagouni noted, the person who pampers himself with dainty foods concocts unhealthy ideas. Or as he put it a little more bluntly in another place, a fat stomach doesn't generate holy thoughts. Some of the monastic fathers used the old adage, you are what you eat, to warn their brotherhoods against animal foods. And they would say, well, you really want to be a hog? You really want to be a boar? You really want to be a cow? A sheep? No, you don't. But the limitations of that argument are obvious because no one really wants to be a vegetable either, at least not in an English-speaking world. Are Armenians keen on fasting because of the mental and spiritual clarity and lightness that fasting brings? Well, yes, certainly they are. The fathers used numerous biblical examples to show how impressively holy people, like the prophet Elijah, fasted to good advantage. No one could have accused Elijah of having been low energy, or lacking in dedication, or lacking in the willingness to take big personal risks by speaking God's truth to power. But even Elijah was only clear-headed enough to have an actual presence-to-presence conversation with God in a cave on Mount Sinai after he had fasted 40 days. The great Moses, too, after he led the people of Israel across the Red Sea, still fasted 40 days before meeting with God, not to do more miracles, but to receive the 10 concise commandments by which God desired the people of Israel to live. And then Moses fasted 40 days again in order to intercede on the people's behalf when God was ready to destroy them. And of course, Jesus fasted 40 days after his baptism before demolishing Satan's temptations with Scripture. So the opening of his ministry mirrors the end of his ministry, where he demolished Satan's greatest weapon, death, both of which we bring together in our Lenten fast. The presentation of Jesus as a newborn child to the temple at 40 days was another paradigm for the fast. During the fast, we prepare ourselves for our own presentation, our dedication, our rededication to the risen Lord. So too, there is a sense in which the Lenten fast is our participation in the same kind of preparation as Elijah and the others, with hopefully similar results for our relationship to the divine and for our relationship to the evil that besets us in our world. To quote Católicos John Montaguni again, don't you know that only those who in a determined way become partakers in the suffering of Christ will be able to share in the glory of the resurrected Christ? Around the turn of the first millennium, Theophilus Vartabed described the Lenten fast as a particularly thrilling chariot race between us and our adversary. He tells us that throughout the course of the fast, Satan will try to run us down or push us off the track. To accomplish this, he has harnessed his chariot to the dark horses of laziness, gluttony, resentment, and adultery. In his sermon on the fifth Sunday of Lent, what Theophilus describes as the 5-mile marker in a 7-mile race, he tells his congregation to harness their spiritual chariots to the 4 sturdy horses of prayer, charity, lack of resentment, and righteous marriage. He encourages his audience to use the clarity of their fasted mind and soul in order to sharpen their weapons, which he describes as words of blessing, charity, thanksgiving, prudence, love, modesty, meekness, and humility, which are powerful against all evil. And he tells them to reach for the prize whose value is 100 or even 1,000 times greater than the effort we put in to attain it. So one would think the manifold physical, mental, and spiritual benefits of fasting and the virtues that it cultivates are surely enough to recommend it to Armenians as a practice. But there is more to it. And Theophilus alludes to this in passing when he refers to the Lenten fast as 7 weeks. And you go, wait a minute, the Lenten fast is 40 days, no? It's modeled on the fasts of Elijah, Moses, Jesus, etc., right? Well, yes and no. Armenians fast for 40 days, like everybody else in the Christian world. But whereas other Christians reach the 40 days and call it quits, Armenians do not. After an Armenian has absorbed the benefits of the 40 days, there comes a moment when he or she will realize that Lent carries on for a full 7 weeks, 48 or 49 days. Why? Isn't that just kind of over the top? Supererogatory fasting? At that point, aren't Armenians just really showing off? Well, the great 10th or 11th century Vartabed, Samvel Gamarchatsoretsi, discusses exactly this point, the extra days of fasting for Armenians. He first describes fasting as a legacy of the Holy Fathers and a revered heritage of the Church. And then he goes on to list and acknowledge all of the associations and the benefits of the 40-day fast. And then he turns his attention to focus on the 7 weeks. Well, obviously, anything involving 7 brings to mind the 7 days of creation, at the end of which we're told on the 7th day, God rested, as he is depicted doing here. And God also commanded that the 7th day be a day of rest for all his people. And so the 7-week fast reminds us that no one has the right to make another or himself work without respite. Rest is not an optional luxury. It is not a privilege. It's a commandment. And not only was 1 day out of 7 set aside by God for rest, but 1 year out of every 7 was set aside as a sabbatical year when all debts were canceled and agricultural work was set aside. So we get it. If 1 day a week is set aside for rest, and 1 year in 7 likewise, then fasting for 7 days times 7 is, on a smaller scale, a token kind of scale. It's like bringing together the accrued years of rest for 7 resting cycles. Thus, Great Lent in the Armenian tradition is our symbolic offering of rest to the creation, including ourselves, out of devotion to the God who himself rested and in the person of Christ offered rest to all those who are weary. But there are 2 ways of counting the Lenten days. One method will give you 48 days. The other will give you 49. Well, for Samvel Vartabed, both those numbers are fine. They both work. He associated them with 2 Old Testament stories. One of them is found in the 35th chapter of the book of Numbers, and the other one is found in the 25th chapter of Leviticus. 2 of those biblical books that pretty much no one reads anymore, but Armenians derived very rich insights from them. For people who count the fasting days as 48, Samvel says, keeping the fast is a beautiful thing because it reminds those people that when Joshua was portioning out the promised land, or the land of good news, the land of the gospel as Armenian calls it, when he was portioning out that land that they had just entered, they haven't conquered it yet, he's portioning it out to the tribes of Israel. No land was given to the priestly tribe of Levi. Instead, they received special cities within the lands that had been allotted to other tribes. And so you could see in the slide the name of the tribe, its territory is delineated for you, and within that you can see how many cities each tribe was supposed to set aside for the priestly class to live in. As a combined reading of Numbers 35 and Joshua 21 tells us, "Command the children of Israel," said God, "that from the inheritance of their possessions, they give to the Levites cities to dwell in, and you shall give the Levites suburbs for their cities. The cities shall be for them to dwell in, and the suburbs shall be for their cattle, for their goods, and for all their beasts. And then Joshua adds, all the cities of the Levites within the lands of the children of Israel were 48 cities with their suburbs. 48. Thus, as Samuel saw it, the 48 days of the fast are a priestly time period. They are there for us to think about our priestly inheritance as Christians in a land that is not our own possession. And it's a chance to think about our priestly responsibilities to the land in which we live as well. From a slightly different point of view, keeping the 48-day fast is also a beautiful thing because of these 48 cities that you will give, Leviticus says, 6 cities shall you have for refuge. They shall be for you cities of refuge from the avenger, so that the manslayer does not die before he stands in front of the congregation for judgment. In other words, of those 48 cities, 6 were designated as refuges for people who had harmed or killed another person. According to the ethics of the time, the relatives of a person who was harmed were obligated to hunt down the offender in righteous anger and take summary revenge on that person, rightfully or wrongfully. So those offenders who were able to reach a priestly city of refuge were protected by the priests from vengeance seekers until such time as they could come to a true trial and a verdict, a just verdict, be delivered in their case. And if the reigning high priest died before the trial happened, the offender was allowed to return to his home without fear that vengeance would be exacted against him when he left the city. So, said Samuel, now Adam and all his descendants, meaning us, are killers. If in no other way than that by the force of our passions we have killed our own souls. He doesn't mention, although others did, the problem of ill will that we have borne towards others, or bad things that we have wished for them, even momentarily, or resentment that we have harbored perhaps towards them, or any harsh, soul-harming words or actions we may have directed towards them. And it leaves completely out of the accounting our inevitable in this complicated world, complicity in enabling the endangerment of workers' lives and health when we purchase products that are made by unethically oppressive companies. We may not be able to avoid it. And yet, says Samuel, we all have need of refuge. And he goes on, the 48 days of the fast are for us a refuge like the priestly cities. And when Christ, our high priest, dies on Easter, we are free. The other story that Samuel brought to his audience was for those who count the fasting days as 49. In the 25th chapter of Leviticus, God sets apart the 49th year, in other words, the end of every 7th sabbatical year cycle. He sets aside that year as the eve before a great coming day or year of rest and restoration. Leviticus says, count off 7 Sabbaths of years, 7 times 7 years. so that the 7 Sabbaths of years amount to a period of 49 years. Then have the trumpet sounded everywhere on the 10th day of the 7th month, on the Day of Atonement. Sound the trumpet throughout your land. Consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each one of you is to return to his family property and each to his own clan. The 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. Do not sow and do not reap what grows of itself, or harvest untended vines. For it is a jubilee, and it is to be holy for you. Eat only what is taken directly from the fields. In this year of jubilee, everyone is to return to his own property. If you sell land to one of your countrymen, or buy any from him, I think before the jubilee year, do not take advantage of each other regarding those sales. So in the 49th year, people could look forward to the coming season when not only would debts be forgiven, but any land that had been sold or that had been lost or that had been taken would have to be returned to its rightful owner. Remember that this is in a society where land is assigned, so one could keep track of those things. It was a time of personal liberty. Slaves were to be manumitted in this year. It was a time of restitution, of relinquishing or letting go things that one had profited by for the previous years. It was a year for simplicity of life. Ideally, at least in the Jubilee year, one eats what one has stored up, allowing the fruit of the trees and the plants to go to seed, fulfilling their natural cycle of life. Thus, fasting in the Armenian tradition, particularly in Great Lent and Avak Shapat, isn't about giving things up, although we do that. And certainly there are a whole range of regulations that lay out different acceptable, uplifting ways to do that. Instead, this extended fasting period is about giving the world, our things, other people, and ourselves a rest. We might never know from looking at a normal Armenian table in Lent that this is what it's for, that it is for simplification of life. But it is. It's about releasing what we have taken for our own use. It's about returning resources to their source. It's about allowing ourselves to replenish. It's about allowing the seas to replenish themselves and the soil to lie fallow so that it can enjoy gathering its strength. It can enjoy simply lying under the sun and the rain with no obligations to us. It's about giving the body's digestive system a rest. It's about giving the animal world a reprieve from our constant and overwhelming demands. To say nothing of a respite from our knives and slaughterhouses and grinders, our grills and our forks and our pots and our ovens and our platters. And according to the fathers, fasting is also about giving rest to all the people who along the invisible production chain labor to prepare our food. Fasting foods are not only to be vegan, they are also to be simple enough that we ourselves can prepare them using our own hands, not the hands and the labor of others. So in these weeks, when we are being forced by the onslaught of a rogue virus to give the world a break from our ceaseless, frenetic, and laborsome movement, it's worth considering how we might intentionalize what we are experiencing. How to make the practical and the spiritual transition from being victims who have been forced to give up our treasured habits to being Sabbath keepers who make these last days of fasting before Easter and beyond this into a gift of love to the planet and to its inhabitants, that God, who himself rested, made for us to inhabit, to share, to cultivate, and to enjoy together. Thank you.